Hello everyone. World history being presented by Sri Kriti Chandra Bhai, History, Odisha State Open University, Samalpur. That is struggle for parliamentary democracy and civil liberties in Britain. We will have some insight into this particular topic. English parliamentary or British parliamentary evolution, we will say that during the 13th and 14th century, there was evolution of parliamentary democracy, but the pace of the evolution was very slow. And the very first step towards rights to the people was the Magna Carta, the Charter Magna Carta, which was developed in 1215, which gave some liberties and rights to the people. Then in the 17th century, we have the Glorious Revolution, finally the passing of the Bill of Rights, which was a major step towards the parliamentary evolution in England particularly. Glorious Revolution, which started, or we can say it came to an end in 1688 with the execution of the king, and further it gave parliament a lot of power, which started to balancing the power between the king or the monarch and the parliament. When we enter into the 17th and 18th century, that was major changes took place, and before that, before whatever the changes or how the British people got the parliamentary rights, before that, let us have a very brief knowledge about what was the nature of British political institutions prior to this parliamentary democracy or growth of parliamentary democracy. The setup of the British government was mostly constitutional monarchy, which means that it was purely a monarchical setup of government where the monarch had unlimited and unrestricted power. But we noted that the monarch had, we can say, had absolute power, and the role of Parliament and House of Commons or a House of Lords was very minimal. The kings, at their will, they used to convene the Parliament whenever there was a necessity, or even they didn't feel the necessity to convene the Parliament. And the Parliament itself was mostly dominated by the Lords or the landed people, so to say. Power dynamics between the Crown and the Parliament was that the king had the utmost power. And even if there was a Parliament consisting of House of Commons and House of Lords, the representation or electoral in the early years of parliamentary democracy was mostly limited to a few people or wealthy people of Great Britain. Third, we can say the parliament was, or the king, or the government, or the administration, so to say, was mostly dominated by the king and the clergies. It was more or less a feudal system of government where the king was at the helm of the affairs. Next, we can say that early demand for reforms. Let us say what were the early demand for reform. We all know that during the 14th century onwards, we have the Renaissance or the Enlightened movement. So people gradually tried to reform this age-old system of monarchical form of government with the calls from the Renaissance, and they demanded for a wider suffrage and fair representation in the parliament. Wider suffrage means larger number of common people should be involved in the administrative process through proper representation. And later on, the working class movement and Chartist movement further boosted this parliamentary revolution in Great Britain. Particularly with the Industrial Revolution, the migration of the people from rural area to the urban area started, and large number of people got themselves engaged in the newly established heavy industries, where they got we can say they became enlightened, and they started demanding more and more rights for them. And another major step during this time was the struggle against the rotten boroughs. Rotten boroughs were those boroughs which were totally controlled by the landlords. Rotten boroughs are So electoral constituencies where the representation was very less and being totally controlled by the landlords, we can say. In this Reform Act, several major steps were taken to strengthen the parliament and gradually to weaken the king's power or monarchical absolutism, we can say. First, the major aspects of the Reform Act of 1832 was it abolished the rotten boroughs, that means the limited present representation by the landlords was abolished. It increased the electorate. Most important aspect is that the electorate or suffrage was increased and is passed to the middle class women. Previously, when only some property people or money people had the control over the election or representation, now it passed to the middle class people, we can say. Secondly, more representation from the industrial towns were engaged. Industrial town, by this time, as I have mentioned earlier, that due to industrial revolution, there was migration from the rural areas to the urban areas, and due to the growth of industrial towns, industrial working class people, they demanded more and more representation for their rights. However, the 1832 Reform Act, it was not a complete act which could provide universal suffrage. So, a 1832 Reform Act did not grant universal suffrage to the people or for representation in the parliament. Then, after a lot of struggle, we can say that the Reform Act of 1832 had a lot of problem within it and lot of lacunas within it. In spite of all these lacunas and weakness, we can say that it was a major step towards the evolution of parliamentary democracy in Great Britain. Then came the Reform Act of 1867. The major principle of this act, or the major areas where this act worked on, was it extended vote to the urban working class men. So the suffrage was extended. That means more and more people now could get themselves involved in the process of representation in the parliament. They could exercise their right to vote. Nearly the electorate doubled this time. That means common people got more chances in the electoral cycle, and after their number was doubled, it gradually or systematically reduced the aristocratic control over the representation. Then came the Reform Act of 1884. So it also further extended the rural working class men. In 1867, what we had observed, that the suffrage was extended to the working class men of the urban areas. Now the rural areas men were deprived of this, but as per the Reform Act of 1884, it was extended to the rural working class men. So we can say nearly a maximum percentage of people could now exercise their voting rights in the evolution of parliamentary democracy. So second important thing is that it created a more uniform electoral system. It created a more uniform electoral system means that people from each section of the society or each class of the society, now they could exercise their voting rights. That means the electoral system was extended to a maximum limit, we can say. So it was a most important Reform Act which we could say that it paved the path for the democratic reforms in England, and gradually it spread to the other parts of Europe. Then another major Reform Act that was passed in 1911, where, as all of us we know, that the British Parliament has two houses. One is House of Commons, mostly represented by the common people or being representative from the common people, and the upper house, which is known as the House of Lords. On several occasions, whenever a bill or act used to go through both this House of the Parliament, it was objected by the House of Lords. But in the Parliament Act of House of Lords was represented by mostly the rich section of the society. So some of the demands of the poorer section or the common section of the society was not fulfilled due to the objection by the House of the Lords. Now, the Parliament Act of 1911 limited the power of House of Lords. It almost reduced the power of the House of Lords, and any bill except few money bills, the bills is automatically passed when it is passed in the House of Commons. So, it also reduced their ability to veto money bills. Some of the money bills which was previously vetoed by the House of Lords, it was reduced and only few bills were left that can be vetoed by the House of Lords. That means the landlord people or the rich section of the people had now a limited power in the parliamentary process, or through we can say that whenever a bill is enacted or a bill is passed in the parliament. So naturally it established the dominance of the elected house, which is the House of Commons. House of Lords is not an elected, it was a representative body. Then another act was enacted in 1918, which is known as the Representation of the People's Act 1918. The major provisions of this act was it granted voting rights to all men over 21, which is in practice nowadays throughout the world mostly, and further the ages have been reduced, and it extended suffrage to women over 30. Now we can say that almost this was a step towards universal suffrage in England. This is known as Representation Act, as it allowed representation to almost all the people of all sections of the society. We can conclude now. It is a very vast story about the evolution of parliamentary democracy in England. However, in briefly, we can conclude that 3 or 4 important aspects we can expand, or we can say. First, that British parliamentary democracy or democracy in Britain evolved gradually. It was not a day's work. Since the time of Magna Carta in 1215 rights, and through 1832 Civil Act or Reform Act to 1918 Act, it had gradually, or it has crossed several steps to reach to a final stage of democracy. And it has now, it is a complete democracy, we can say, with almost all the power vested in the people's hand or representatives and those were chosen by the people. Now, key reforms which I have mentioned already, 1832, so to say, 1867 or 1911, definitely in this process, it has expanded the suffrage, which now we can say that it is an universal suffrage, inclusive of all men and women, and has reduced the aristocratic influence, we can say. And in the 20th century, we can say that the entire England or the British political system has become full democratic, totally democratic, we can say, where the people has utmost right to control the government. So this evolution or the parliamentary evolution has major contribution to the world governmental system or administrative system. Gradually it influenced the other European nation and it spread to the other parts of the country, other parts of the globe where the British had their colonies or may not be having their colonies. So definitely the parliamentary evolution in England paved the way for the modern parliamentary democracy throughout the world. So hopefully with this we will conclude this session, and in the next session we will see about the 4 years in France and England. Thank you very much for a kind attention. Thank you.